Okay, welcome to our Gender in Video Games presentation, our connections to the gender sociology. So we decided to look at 3 games, Undertale, Breath of the Wild, and Animal Crossing New Horizons, by Gabriel, Garner, Stoddard, and Sammy, Zeino.
So to begin, we wanted to kind of go over some of the interesting topics around this issue of gender in video games. First, we wanted to look at the portrayal of men versus women within the games. That's pretty prevalent within this presentation. And then toxic masculinity within video games. Alongside this, the reason why video games are developed in such a gendered manner, and the broader effects of video games on society, and also society's effects on video games, so how they react and create standards actually within the games. And from this, we basically came up with a basic research question / mission where we came up with how do video games reinforce or reject traditional understandings of gender roles, and what does this understanding mean for the way video games are developed? So basically, what we're trying to do is attempt to understand the role that gender actually plays within video games based on how various characters are portrayed through both their outward and their inward appearance. So to give some basic background on this issue, so you kind of get an idea of why gender in video games is so important. According to research, 67% of households in the US possess a gaming console, and 33% say they play video games at least once per week. And this number is actually on the rise. Increasingly, more and more people are actually playing video games as our society evolves and uses more and more technology. And especially now with the quarantine, probably a ton more people are playing video games because they're stuck in their house all day. Alongside this, like other forms of media, such as TV, video games serve as a source of socialization. So like we learned in class about the learning and injection model of socialization, video games, once they're played, can kind of shape how someone is socialized and how they see the world around them. So to go into some basic research around this issue, according to various research, male characters actually outnumber females by 4 to 1. This varied based on different sources, but some found only like 3 to 1, whereas others was up to as much as like 6 to 1. But basically from this, you can see that male characters far outnumber the amount of females. So you just tend to see more male characters in general in video games. Alongside this, male characters tend to play central roles, whereas females play secondary background roles. So typically the protagonist in any video game will be a man, whereas the women might be involved in the game, but they still play more of a background role and they're not as important. Alongside this, one of the big problematic things about how many video games have been presented over the years is that female characters are heavily sexualized, and they're also kind of described as a damsel in distress, meaning that basically they are someone that is kind of doesn't really serve much of a purpose in a video game other than being saved by another male character. And you'll see that in some of the later examples in this presentation. And then male characters tend to be unnaturally muscularized and heterosexual. So you'll see in a lot of games, the characters are unnaturalistic. In an unnatural way, they are extremely muscular. And this also kind of promotes various tropes. But hardcore games, including action, shooter, and fighting games, these include games like Call of Duty and Mortal Kombat. These are the games that tend to display these tropes more than casual games, such as like sport games like FIFA or even like Mario Kart, things like that. You see less of these tropes, but it tends to be the hardcore games that there is more prevalence of kind of a problematic gendered perspective. So going to the next slide, we see a couple or a graph here that basically in this one I wanted to just display how, video games are typically seen in society as something that a lot of men play, and that they tend to be viewed as like mostly men. But as you can see from this graph that covers between 2006 and 2019, not only has that number been shrinking, more females are starting to play, but it was actually never even that distance. I mean, maybe you go back to 2006, it was 62 to 38. That's quite a divide. But now you see up to 2019, it's now a 54-46 divide. So basically almost half and half male and female, which goes into, after looking at the background information about seeing how men are much more prevalent within video games, this is much more problematic, because if women and men are quite equal among who's playing the games, then why do men become so prevalent within the actual games, and why are they the more important characters? So in this next graph, it's basically just displaying the video game protagonist by gender. This was based on games at E3, which is a very prevalent gaming conference. And basically in this, you can see that most the most prevalent option for protagonist is actually multiple options. So with gender, but what you notice here, like I talked about earlier, is men in the games where you only have one choice of gender, it tends to be a male. As you can see, based on the years, women don't even break over 10% in any of these graphs, and men typically sit around between 25 and 41%. So they tend to be, if there's only one option for a gender, it tends to be a male. Otherwise, it's multiple options. And then also gender ambiguous is very low. So we don't see a lot of like non-binary options or things like that. But moving on now. So basically, in this slide, I just want to talk about the effects of gender perceptions in video games. So far we've learned the various discrepancies among men and women and their portrayals in video games, how they're portrayed, and also how prevalent they are. And basically, based on various studies that have been done from this, it's been found out that there's an increased belief in false rape accusation and rape myths from playing highly gendered video games. So you see things like victim blaming and beliefs that women in some way want to be raped, things like that have become more prevalent among especially men that tend to play the more hardcore games and promote these gender tropes. Alongside this, these video games uphold traditional views of masculinity versus femininity. So like we learned in class, people from playing these games tend to see men as being guys that need to be dominant and not showing emotion, whereas women tend to be the ones that need to be taken care of. And from this, it portrays the view that women are in need of protection and can't hold high power positions. So that kind of goes off the whole fact that that women tend to not be the protagonist in most games. You don't see a lot of women being the leading characters. Alongside this, the view that men are viewed as leaders that tend to control and dominate women. And then lastly, a very modern kind of issue related to this is what's known as the Gamergate movement, which was basically an online harassment campaign toward female game developers Zoe Quinn and Brianna Wu. But it basically grew into a larger movement that was on platforms such as 4chan, Twitter, and Reddit that include things such as doxing, threats of rape, and death, where it was basically a response to a view in society that games are starting to become more socially conscious, in the fact that people are realizing now that women actually do play video games at a very high rate, and that women should be included more in the storylines behind video games and just the raw number of women that are in video games. So basically, this Gamergate movement was an online movement in response to that. That was kind of came from this belief that feminists were kind of taking over the gaming industry and were trying to force progressive values down people's throats. But instead, really, it was mostly a sort of reaction from women within the gaming industry and people in media to say that women are actually very prominent in the gaming industry in terms of who actually is playing the video games. So why are they not being represented within the video games? And alongside that, why are continuously we see games today, just like games such as Grand Theft Auto, you see very negative tropes against women, and they're very sexualized, whereas men are viewed in this traditional dominant kind of fashion. So going on from this, the reality of gender in video games. So why do women and men get portrayed in a certain light in video games, in a lot of them currently? Well, first off, from research, a lot of people think it is the market, basically, that sex and violence sells. So one of the highest, most bought games in the gaming industry is actually Grand Theft Auto, and this game is a game that promotes a lot of these tropes. Is very violent and involves a lot of sexualizing of women. Alongside that, you see games like Call of Duty, where violence is very prevalent. So really, the belief from this is that basically these are the types of games that sell among people, and that in itself might be problematic. But also alongside this is there's a lack of representation of women in the gaming industry. So even though women actually play video games at almost an equal rate of men, if you can see on this graph here on the right, basically in the gaming industry, only 22% of all game developers are actually women, and only 2% are actually transgender. So the dominant over 3/4 of all game people working in the game develop industry are men. So from this, it in some ways is no surprise that we actually see mostly men, or mostly a kind of traditional view of men and a promotion of stereotypes of women, because the people developing the games are very, very heavily favored toward men instead of women. And alongside this, a third reason is the lack of knowledge of gender studies within the gaming industry. So a lot of people have also recognized that a lot of people within the gaming industry, whether men or women, are not extremely knowledgeable on the issue of gender studies and why it's important, because video games serve such a role of socialization. So basically, from this, people think that we need to include more people with knowledge of gender issues, to make video games more socially conscious, because they can play such an affecting role on especially like young people in the world today.
Choose your character. So we've chosen to look at 3 games, and we decided to look at them chronologically. So our first one is Undertale. It was released September 15th, 2015 by publisher Toby Fox and Game Maker Studio. And the premise of the game is that a player controls a child who's fallen into this world called the Underground. And basically the human world and a monster world are separated by a magical barrier. And the player meets various monsters during his journey back to the human side, to the surface. The second game is The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. It was released March 3rd, 2017. The publisher is Nintendo. And the premise of the game is it's in the Zelda timeline. The player controls a character named Link who awakens from a 100-year slumber to defeat Calamity Ganon before it can destroy the kingdom of Hyrule. So the world is unstructured and designed to reward experimentation, same way that Undertale and Animal Crossings are. But the next game is Animal Crossings. It was released March 20th, 2020, so fairly recently, actually. And the publisher is Nintendo. And the premise of the game is there's a customizable character who moves to a deserted island, and taking place in real time, the character can explore the island, gather and craft items, catch insects and fish, and develop the island into a community, into a neighborhood for the residents, which are animals. Okay, so our first game is Undertale, and I chose these pictures because I felt that they accurately represented the game, and it's kind of its whole aesthetic. It's very simple in its design, but that adds more, I think, to the cognitive contributions that a player makes onto the game. As our main character, you can see, is at the bottom right, which the developers call Frisk. And you can see basically how you can fight, act, look at your items, or mercy, which you can spare your opponent. And that becomes very evident. A main idea is whether or not you choose to be aggressive or passive in your gameplay. Characters. Within Undertale, there are a mighty cast of characters with genderqueer identities. So all of the characters actually have no stereotypical gender preferences, and in fact, none of them have a labeled gender. The developers chose not to use pronouns, and this is evident especially with the main protagonist, who is considered ambiguous. So the characters in the game refer to the protagonist as the child, or the name that the player chooses to bestow to the child. And because of this genderqueerness, this ambiguity, the player is able to experience sexuality preferences based upon their understanding of character content. So when they look at a character and they see, oh, I think that character's feminine, or oh, I think that character's masculine, oh, maybe that's a man, that's a woman, maybe they're non-binary, the character almost, in a sense, is able to choose that for themselves, and therefore experience a range of different relationships. For example, with Dr. Alphys and the child, and then Papyrus and the child, one of the side quests is you can go on a date with these characters. And it's the kind of game where a tutu has the same amount of protection power that a plate of armor has. Also, with Undyne, they have heels and a disco ball, so they could be a man in drag, or they could be a woman, or they could be neither. And the gender identity and gender expression is basically up to the player and how they choose to interpret that. The binary influence and straight washing. So there's one critique that keeps popping up and up and up, and it's this straight washing of Undertale. So I would instead say that it's like an androcentricity washing, as the hegemonic ideologies and the perceived gamer default. What I mean by perceived gamer default is believe that the main core audience group are white, straight, cisgender men and boys. As you can see from the quote from Ruberg, it is common to witness considerable resistance to the inclusion of queer content in games, especially from those sectors of games culture dominated by white, straight, cisgender men and boys, still commonly presumed by many content producers to be the core audience for video games. Like whitewashing, according to Ruberg, the works are stripped of their connection. It's a symbolic wiping away of the LGBTQ plus aspects within the game by choosing to identify and talk up the men of the game and the tech that went into it, rather than focusing on the actual emotional capacity that the game offers. Ruberg feels is doing the game a disservice. This picture is of our main protagonist, and I chose this image because I felt like it was kind of funny. So somebody asks, "Are you a boy or a girl?" And they go, "I'm a child." And they say, "But what's in your pants?" And the kid goes, "Determination." The Undertale phenomenon. So basically, Undertale is a world where queerness is common and there's no standard binary or sexuality. It doesn't queerbait, and it doesn't make this decision obvious. Like Toby Fox said in April of 2017, 2 years after it initially came out, "I'm really glad the game has given kids exposure to a story where queerness is normal." Most players, however, fill in the genders and sexuality preferences according to their own self-identification and self-ideologies, and therefore it sets the masculine above the feminine, usually, following the common stereotypes, and players, in a sense, gender police themselves and the characters within the game. They fill in those blanks according to what they know of the culture, and therefore demonstrate that they are culturally competent. For Ruberg, she talks specifically of boys and men who are misogynistic. Their patriarchal privilege attempts to reassert its position over women and others considered outsiders, either intentionally or otherwise. So how has Undertale managed to become a beloved and accepted game, despite anti-queer and toxic gamer culture? Well, despite negative context on both sides, either saying that we don't give credit where credit is due, or we're focusing on praising the wrong things, to me, the game just has a morose, dry sense of humor about life, overcoming difficulties, remaining determined, and staying true to yourself. Consumers, specifically women, also enjoy a culture and a plot devoid of sexual exploitation, demeaning dialogue, androcentric character and plot development, and hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity. I'm going to go into this more. So, for sexual exploitation, there is a consent culture that is present in this game that I don't think I've seen in a lot of others. For instance, when you go on your date with Papyrus, you spend forever talking to him, and as a gamer, you expect to get some kind of reward in the end and something to move the plot. But at the end, Papyrus says, "I don't like you the way you like me, I don't think." And in that way, it's giving choice, and it's not saying that when you play this game, that relationship or sex comes as a reward, which you see in a lot of games, especially between a male and a female in the game. For demeaning dialogue, your save points, you were filled with determination. You were also a child within the game, and basically you help create a culture when you're talking to these different monsters and you're choosing to spare them or fight them. Either way, when you talk to them, it's very much like you're creating a connection to the characters and trying to help them. The androcentric character and plot development. So Flowey is a yellow flower, very cute yellow flower, who turns out to be the most evil and the most knowledgeable character. And you wouldn't expect this of a flower because you assume flowers femininity, which means weakness. So also with the child. And then with hegemonic masculinity and emphasized femininity, It's easier to kill an opponent in this game and move on, but you're not going to get as many rewards as if you care about the character, develop a beneficial relationship, and get more worthwhile gameplay. It's caring over killing, and you have to tap into your emotions and negotiation skills.
So going into this is Legend of the Zelda Breath of the Wild. Looking at some characters, first off, the main character in Zelda is Link, who is a character that, while male, he doesn't actually represent the traditional trope that is portrayed in a lot of video games of hypermasculinity. In many ways, he's actually a very gender-neutral character, and even the Zelda designer, Eiji Aonuma, said he wanted a character that would be relatable to all genders. So therefore, Link has multiple non-masculine characters, such as long hair, and even the dress that he wears is not extremely masculine. And so basically, this is kind of a way of Zelda actually breaking from tradition, in the sense that they're not following that traditional hypermasculinity among their male characters. But it should be noted that their main character is a male. And so the next character I covered was Zelda, who, she's the most prominent female character in the Zelda series. I mean, she's literally the name of the series, but she's actually not the most prominent. Link is. And she's a princess that's basically presented in a traditional feminine manner with long hair. But unlike other Zelda games, in Breath of the Wild, she's actually not wearing her traditional long dress. They've kind of put her in a dress much more similar to Link. So that was kind of breaking from tradition within the Zelda series. But she's still, once again, portrayed in a much more feminine manner. And she is not the actual protagonist within the series. She kind of serves as a secondary character to Link. And then finally, the third character I covered was Ganon. He's the main antagonist in Breath of the Wild, and he represents the traditional hypermasculine display that I talked about earlier. He's extremely tall with unrealistic muscular appearance, and he has a large amount of facial hair. So this one kind of goes along with most of the stereotypes that is typically presented of men, which is that they are extremely buff, basically, and other things such as being tall and having facial hair just goes along with those tropes, as he is the main villain in this series. So then going into the next slide, I'm just going to be talking about gender representation in the Breath of the Wild. So how do I believe gender is perceived in this game? And though I talked about earlier how Link is given the appearance of a gender-neutral character, in many ways, The Legend of Zelda is just as problematic in its representation of gender as other games. First, even though Zelda is actually the title of the game series, as I said earlier, she just plays a secondary character. And in most of the Zelda games, including Breath of the Wild, she is presented as basically the damsel in distress that I talked about earlier that needs saving. In most games, Link is the one that, he comes and saves her, basically. And in Breath of the Wild, she does possess some power, but those powers are actually kind of taken away, and she's losing some of them. So once again, she needs Link, a male character, to save her and the Kingdom of Hyrule. And alongside this, Ganon, the main villain that I talked about earlier, he originates from what's known as the Gerudo tribe, which interestingly it's an all-female tribe, but Ganon, the only male that actually comes from the tribe, is presented as the ruler of those women and is the ultimate villain in the series. So this kind of goes along with the fact that even though the Zelda series was kind of interesting in the fact that the tribe that the main villain originated from was it was literally an all-female tribe except Ganon. It just happened to be that Ganon, the only male, was the one that basically dominates and leads the women, as he is the main villain. So that in itself was also problematic. So in many ways, basically Breath of the Wild, even though it has some, kind of breaking of tradition with how they display like Link as more of a gender-neutral character, it still has many problematic tropes in the way that its main storyline has been presented, not only in Breath of the Wild, but also among the entire series of Legend of Zelda.
The game I'll be covering today is Animal Crossing New Horizons, a cozy game about turning a deserted island into your own personal paradise. So for some background, this is the 5th entry in the Animal Crossing series, which began with a game called The Botsu no Mori, which was released with the Nintendo 64 in Japan in the year 2001. This series came to America in 2002 with a GameCube release, just Animal Crossing, population growing. The main draws of this series were its real-time clock mechanic, a village with cute animal villagers, and a house you could decorate. Subsequent releases expanded on this, and bit by bit they added things such as online play with friends, more customization options for characters, larger character rosters for villagers, and of course they improved the graphics quite a bit. As I said before, Animal Crossing New Horizons is the 5th main series entry in the Animal Crossing series. As a whole, Animal Crossing has dealt with the protagonist or player character's gender in the same way. At the beginning of the game, you enter a dialogue with a cat by the name of Rover, and through your responses, your character's appearance and gender would take shape. For example, in Animal Crossing New Leaf, after entering your name, Rover will say it's a great name, prompting you to respond with your 2 options. Cool, right? Or cute, right? Cool corresponds to a masculine character using he, him pronouns, and cute corresponds to a feminine character with she, her pronouns. In New Horizons, this all changes, though. They retcon the dialogue system and streamline the character creation process. The biggest change from prior entries is the ability to change your style, or gender, at will. New Horizons also uses no masculine or feminine pronouns to refer to your character. The few times it comes up in the game, they use they or them. All clothing items in the game are available to all player characters as well as hairstyles and facial features, as demonstrated by my character below.
Class-connected concepts. So for this part, I feel like we've done a pretty good job of demonstrating how we've taken these games and we've moved it into the arena of gender sociology. However, these are some of the things that we looked at, some of the things that we remember from class that helped inspire us. First of all, Weston Zimmerman's Doing Gender. So we thought about variation in gender rules, gender policing, and the gender binary glasses. For instance, Doing Gender involves a complex of socially guided perceptual, interactional, and micropolitical activities. And this made us think perceptual, interactional, micropolitical, video games. Judith Lorber's Night to His Day. We thought of stratification, gendered institutions, gender salience. So everyday gendered interactions build gender into the family, the work process, and other organizations and institutions, which in turn reinforce gender expectations for individuals. So the video game institution. Dozards, beards, breasts, and bodies. We thought of sexual dimorphism, learned versus biological differences. Assuming social interaction creates a feminine or masculine consciousness fails to explain how people grow up with a gender identity contrary to that expected from their socialization.
Our main takeaway from all this is that video games are no exception to the rules and contracts surrounding gender in our society. And as you play, it's important to remain cognizant of all the unconscious bias we may have as we consume this type of media, and of course, make meaningful gameplay choices.
So here's our credit screen, if you will. These are our references. We have about 3 to 4 academic journals, essays, and we have several articles from class, such as the ones mentioned on our class connection slides. And so that's our credit screen. Thank you guys so much for coming to our presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something. And a big shout out to everybody who is doing distance learning right now. I know it was very difficult for us to complete this assignment, but we had a lot of fun. Bye.